Former Trump-affiliated attorneys Sidney Powell and Lin Wood have hired representation to represent them at their upcoming sanctions hearing in Michigan on July 13th. This sanctions hearing is in relation to the Kracken lawsuit filed back during the 2020 election, which was dismissed in December of 2020. Following the dismissal, and importantly, following the Capitol riots, the defendants in that case asked the judge to sanction Sidney Powell, Lin Wood, and the other attorneys that were in the case for their bad faith lawsuit. They said the lawsuit was entirely frivolous and that it had no basis in fact or law. And of course, Sidney Powell and Lin Wood have always maintained that their lawsuits were not frivolous, but rather were presenting novel questions of law in an election and had serious questions about what had happened in various states involving specific voter machines. Now, I'm not making any statements about the veracity of their claims. I am merely reporting on the issues in this video. You have to make up your own mind on all of that stuff, okay? But they are now going to their sanctions hearing, which will be happening in just under 2 weeks. And let's take a look back at some of the allegations against them and talk about what they are facing. I'm Nick Ricada of Ricada Law, a small law firm in central Minnesota. I'm a lawyer. I'm also a legal and political commentator on YouTube and on Odyssey. Wherever you're watching, go ahead, hit like, hit subscribe, turn on your notifications, and don't miss any videos. Okay, here we go. This is from Reuters. I'll have this article and the next one linked down in the description if you want to check them out for yourself. We'll be just taking a peek at them here. But it says Sidney Powell and Lin Wood tap Michigan counsel ahead of sanctions hearing. Sidney Powell, Lin Wood, and other attorneys facing potential sanctions for their roles in trying to overturn Michigan's 2020 electoral results in favor of former President Donald Trump have turned to a pair of attorney grievance and ethics specialists from a local Michigan law firm. Donald Campbell and Patrick McGlynn, attorneys at Southfield, Michigan-based Collins Einhorn Farrell PC, filed notices of appearance on Wednesday in Detroit federal court on behalf of lawyers Powell, Wood, Scott Hagerstrom, Julia Haller, Brandon Johnson, Gregory Roll, and Howard Kleinhendler. And the sad thing about this, the really sad thing about this is it's entirely possible that these guys will be attacked for their support of Lin Wood and Sidney Powell. The other lawyers are kind of ancillary to this, in my opinion. But Powell and Wood have become lightning rods, both political and professional lightning rods in the legal and especially election spheres. Lin Wood is currently being investigated by Georgia's Board of Ethics, and he has been accused of some things in the Rittenhouse case, which we'll cover in probably a separate video. But they have become the targets of a lot of heat based primarily on their activities surrounding the 2020 election, both for lawsuits that they filed in relation to the election and probably even more so due to statements each of them made in public and on their now banned social media accounts about the election itself and about the conduct of people and parties within that election. And the sanctions filing is kind of a result of that. The sanctions filing is reflective of those external statements. And I think that might be a little bit improper in general. However, the point I was making, though, is that Mr. Campbell and Mr. McGlynn, in representing Sidney Powell and Lin Wood, may be attracting some unwarranted heat on themselves. And that is really unfortunate because as attorneys, representation of a client does not endorse the client's behavior. It is merely a recognition of everyone's right to due process and competent counsel. But that's something that attorneys are forgetting or ignoring as it becomes expedient to them in recent years. We're seeing more and more attorneys attacking other attorneys based on whom they choose to represent and how they conduct their representation. And I'm not talking about legal matters. I'm talking about with the vigor and zeal that is sometimes required to represent a client. Many attorneys are just ignoring that that's a reality of the profession. And to me, that is one of the most concerning things about all of this. Okay, but the filings say that Campbell and McGlynn were hired in response to a June 17th order by U.S. District Judge Linda Parker mandating that every attorney whose names are on the pleadings in the election challenge lawsuit must appear at a July 13th hearing over whether they should be sanctioned. The lawyers alleged in the lawsuit that a vast tangled fraud allowed Biden to flip the state and win over Trump. Parker dismissed those allegations back in December. And to be completely fair, there were some real problems with that filing. One of the big ones that I noticed was that there was a list of counties and vote totals that was presented for Michigan, and those counties weren't actually Michigan counties. They were Minnesota counties. I only caught it right away because my county was listed on there as well. And that type of oversight sometimes happens in a case when that evidence is being presented by one of the witnesses. However, it really shouldn't happen very often. But to mitigate that, and to mitigate a lot of this, and I assume this is part of what's going to be argued in defense of all of these attorneys, is that election lawsuits are particularly complicated because they often touch on novel facts, novel issues, novel legal questions, and the time frame to decide all of them is the short time between when votes are cast in early November and when electoral votes are certified and the election is certified in early January. That is not a long window for a lawsuit at all. Everything is done on an expedited and emergency basis. Briefing windows are very, very short, and oral arguments, if you even get to have them, have to be done very quickly. Everything is time sensitive. And because of that time sensitive crunch, there should be a little more leeway for some inaccuracies to be to show up and then be corrected when they're pointed out. In this case, there wasn't really any opportunity to correct those inaccuracies. The entire thing was thrown out by the judge at the onset. So we didn't really get to see this thing unfold. And I think that's going to, again, play into the arguments here. But let's take a look back to a portion of their sanctions push. Let's take a look back over here to a portion of when they were actually pushing for the sanctions. This is from an article back in January. As part of its sanction request, Detroit has asked the court to refer Powell, Wood, and other attorneys who signed on to the lawsuit to the Michigan Attorney Discipline Board, to the disciplinary authorities of their home jurisdiction. So they're asking for these attorneys to be disciplined, not just in Michigan. That's what the sanctions would be. Probably a monetary sanction, maybe attorney's fees for the defendants, something like that. But they're further asking for disciplinary actions in the attorneys' home states. It also requested Powell, Wood, and their colleagues be disbarred from the U.S. District Court of the Eastern District of Michigan, where the lawsuit has been waged since November 25th. The sanctions brief have touched on Powell and Wood's apparent embrace of the QAnon conspiracy theory on Twitter. The plaintiffs on January 14th pushed back against Detroit's citation of Powell and Wood's tweets, saying the social media posts were out of context and irrelevant to the case. And this has been one of the main issues in Sidney Powell and Lin Wood's case. There has been a desire for their social media tweets to be factored into their legal cases. And we, of course, have seen this in the defamation suits against Sidney Powell as well from Dominion, that they are trying to weave the filings and the social media posts together in various ways. And it's almost like a trap here, where they're trying to mitigate an attorney's right to free speech in public forums on public issues and mitigate that based on their legal representation. So that will be an interesting question to see how that is argued and resolved in the upcoming case. Because in my opinion, lawyers still have they still get to exercise their full free speech rights. And whether you agree with Sidney Powell and Lin Wood or not, and a whole lot of people don't agree with them, they should have the right to say what they want to say on these issues, certainly in public forums and certainly outside of their representation. And if it's not filed in a brief and not submitted to the court and not argued at oral argument, is it actually a part of the representation and representation in that case? And that's going to be a question probably in this sanctions hearing, is how much of this is representation before the court and how much of this is a free speech right outside of the context of that representation. And that is something we'll be looking for. But however you slice it, the attorneys who defended Donald Trump in the 2020 election have been targeted, ostracized, and having to watch their backs, so to speak, both personally and professionally, ever since their representation in the 2020 election. And that really is a shame. If there are legal issues and matters that need to be resolved, attorneys need to be able to represent whatever client and ask whatever questions without fear of persecution and repercussion from that representation. That is part of our duty, is to represent a broad array of clients on a broad array of issues. And the chilling effect that this potential sanctions hearings and other similar actions have on attorney-client relationships is a little bit disconcerting for me. But that's me. I don't know. What do you guys think? Why don't you tell me in a comment below? And until next time, thanks for watching. Peace. Peace.